The departure checklist was pinned to the wall of Callum Bryce's laboratory in the Imperial Botanical Research Station, handwritten on actual paper, because Callum had discovered early in his contract that Vethari data systems were incompatible with human organizational software, and that the most reliable technology available to him was a pen. The list contained 43 items. He had completed 37 of them. The remaining 6 involved equipment cataloging, data export verification, and a final meeting with the Vethari Academic Oversight Board that he anticipated would be brief, cordial, and exactly as stilted as every previous interaction with the Oversight Board, which operated with the warm approachability of a tax audit conducted by people who suspected you of enjoying yourself. 9 days until departure, his transport was booked, his quarters were half-packed. His research, 14 months of fieldwork cataloging the adaptive pollination mechanisms of Vethari highland flora, work that had taken him into mountain ecosystems so remote and so beautiful that he had occasionally forgotten he was on an alien planet and simply experienced the ancient, uncomplicated joy of a scientist alone with something worth understanding, was compiled, reviewed, and formatted for the academic journals that would publish it and the 17 people who would read it. Callum was 31. He looked like what he was, a field researcher who spent more time in soil than in society. His brown hair existed in a state of permanent negotiation with gravity, having been shaped by 14 months of highland wind and a grooming routine that consisted primarily of pushing it out of his eyes when it interfered with his ability to look through a microscope. His hands were the hands of a botanist, perpetually stained with plant pigment and soil in the creases of his knuckles and beneath his nails, a condition he had stopped apologizing for approximately 6 years into his career, when he realized that the stains were not going away, and that apologizing for them was like apologizing for breathing. He was lean, not tall, built by hiking rather than intention, with a face that was pleasant in the way that faces are pleasant when they belong to people who are not thinking about their faces. Unremarkable features arranged in an expression of mild concentration that was his default state, and that shifted to mild confusion when interrupted, which was about to happen. Nailith appeared in the laboratory doorway at 16:23 station time. He knew it was 16:23 because he had been logging a specimen, and the timestamp was on his screen, and he would remember this detail later with the peculiar precision that the mind applies to the last normal moment before everything changes. She stood in the doorway the way people stand when they are carrying something they have not yet decided how to deliver. Weight shifted slightly forward, hands at her sides but not relaxed, her body occupying the threshold between his space and the corridor, as though the doorframe itself represented a decision she was still making. She was tall, 5'10", with the angular grace that characterized Vethari physiology, a species whose bone structure gave them the quality of being sculpted rather than grown. Her skin was a deep, warm bronze, richer than any human skin tone, with the matte luminosity that Vethari pigmentation carried, as though light did not reflect off her surface, but was absorbed and re-emitted at a slightly warmer frequency. Her eyes were amber copper, striking and intense, with narrow vertical pupils that adjusted with emotional state in ways that Callum had spent 8 months learning to read and had never quite mastered. Along her cheekbones and tracing toward her temples, fine bioluminescent vein patterns pulsed in rhythms that mapped to physiological and emotional conditions, usually a calm, steady amber in Nailith's case, the signature of someone whose baseline was composed and analytical. The patterns were not amber now. They were shifting through colors that Callum had never seen on her, rapid alternations between deep copper and pale gold, the Vethari equivalent of a heart racing so fast it could not decide what it was feeling. Nailith, he set down his specimen forceps. I thought your rotation was in the eastern wing today. It is. She stepped into the laboratory, the door closed behind her. I need to tell you something. Their relationship had lasted 5 months. It had begun in the field station at Highland Site 12, where proximity, shared intellectual curiosity, and the specific intimacy that develops between two people conducting research in an isolated alpine environment had combined into something that surprised both of them. Callum, because he had not anticipated finding connection on a contract assignment, and Nalith because human Vethari relationships existed in a social category that her culture acknowledged theoretically and discouraged practically. The way a fire safety manual acknowledges that fires happen, while strongly recommending they do not. They had ended it 3 months ago, mutually and amicably, because his departure date was fixed and her life was here, and neither of them had wanted to transform something genuine into something that hurt. The ending had been clean, mature, the kind of conclusion that adults arrived at when they respected each other enough to be honest about logistics. Nalith told him the ending had been incomplete. She told him she was pregnant. She told him the child was his. Callum experienced, in the space of approximately 4 seconds, a sequence of cognitive events that his nervous system would spend weeks trying to organize into a coherent narrative. The first was incomprehension, the word pregnant arriving in his brain and finding no prepared response, because the possibility had not been on any checklist he had ever made. The second was the biological mathematics of timeline and probability, assembling themselves with the mechanical efficiency of a calculation that did not care whether its operator was ready for the result. The third was the beginning of something enormous and unformed that rose in his chest like a tide, and that he could not yet name because naming it required a stability of thought that the previous 2 seconds had thoroughly dismantled. "You're certain," he said, because his voice needed to say something and certainty was the only variable he could address. Vethari gestational indicators are unambiguous. Her bioluminescent patterns had steadied slightly, settling into the pale gold that he had learned during their months together meant she had committed to a course of action and was executing it regardless of fear. "I confirmed 16 days ago. I did not tell you immediately because I needed to." She stopped, started again. "I needed to decide whether to tell you at all. And you decided yes. I decided that you deserve to know. What happens after that, I do not." The station's security klaxons activated. Not the measured amber pulse of a drill or a systems test, but the rapid crimson strobe of a full lockdown. And the sound that accompanied it was not an alarm so much as a declaration. The deep, resonant harmonic that Vethari security systems used to communicate that whatever was happening at the highest possible level of authority. Empress Valith Sorkine arrived at the research station 47 minutes after the lockdown initiated, which meant she had been in transit before the lockdown was triggered, which meant she had known before the alarm sounded, which meant the information had reached her through channels that operated faster than official security protocols, and with the kind of priority that only applied when the threat was not to the station, but to the ascendancy itself. Callum saw her from behind a security cordon that had been established in the station's central atrium, a barrier of Vethari guards whose bioluminescent patterns were synchronized in the deep blue of active duty, a frequency that suppressed individual emotional display and replaced it with collective operational focus, turning a group of individuals into a single functioning unit. Through the gaps between armored bodies, he watched the Empress enter. She was taller than any Vethari he had met, over 6 feet, with the bearing of someone whose body had been trained from birth to occupy space as though the space had been built for her, which in most cases it had. Her skin was deep twilight bronze, darker than Nalith's, with the particular density of pigmentation that Vethari associated with ancient bloodlines. Genetics, so carefully maintained across centuries that the skin itself had developed a quality that was less color than material, as though she had been cast from something more permanent than biology. Her eyes were molten gold, luminous and absolute, without the copper warmth of Nalith's, but with an intensity that made warmth irrelevant because warmth implied approachability. And this woman had been engineered, genetically and culturally, to be approached only on her terms. Her features were severe, cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows, a jaw that carried the angular precision of her species' bone structure at its most refined, and a mouth set in an expression that was not angry so much as beyond anger, occupying a territory past fury where emotion had been compressed into something denser and more dangerous. The bioluminescent tracery along her temples and brow was burning, deep crimson, pulsing in rapid, jagged rhythms that the Vethari guards recognized and responded to by widening their perimeters without being told. Because sovereign rage was not a metaphor in Vethari culture, but a physiological state that radiated at frequencies the body could feel, and the Empress was radiating at a level that made the air in the atrium feel heavier. Petra Akafer found Callum 3 minutes later. Petra was the human diplomatic liaison assigned to the research program, a woman in her 40s whose career had been built on the principle that if you put humans and aliens in proximity long enough, something would go wrong, and her job was to be present when it did. She was compact, direct, and possessed the particular calm of someone who had managed diplomatic incidents on 4 worlds, and who treated each new crisis with the professional composure of a surgeon who had stopped being surprised by what she found when she opened the patient. "Your departure clearance has been revoked," she said. "Your communication access is restricted to this station's internal network. External transmissions are blocked." "What is happening?" "The Empress knows about the pregnancy." "That's how Vethari medical systems are integrated with the Imperial Genetic Registry. The moment Nalith's gestational indicators were confirmed by any medical scanner on this planet, the data was flagged, categorized, and escalated. An unauthorized conception triggers automatic reporting. A hybrid unauthorized conception triggers." Petra paused, choosing her words. "A different level of response," she explained. She explained with the measured thoroughness of someone who had reviewed Vethari genetic law during her assignment preparation, and who had filed it under scenarios that will never happen, and was now retrieving it from that category, with the grim recognition that the category had been optimistic. Vethari genetic doctrine was not a preference. It was the foundational architecture of their civilization. Every conception in Vethari society was authorized through the Imperial Genetic Oversight Bureau, planned, verified, approved. The system had maintained their species' genomic stability for over 2,000 years, producing a population whose biological consistency was unmatched by any known species. It was eugenics elevated to constitutional law and practiced with the systematic thoroughness of a civilization that had decided, 20 centuries ago, that their genome was their most valuable asset and that protecting it justified any measure. Unauthorized conception was criminal. Hybrid conception, Vethari genetic material combined with alien biology, was not merely criminal but classified as biological contamination, a legal category written with the implicit assumption that it would never be invoked because the safeguards were considered sufficient. The safeguards had not been sufficient because the safeguards had not accounted for a human xenobotanist and a Vethari researcher spending 5 months in an isolated mountain field station, discovering that the barriers between species were more permeable than either civilization's paperwork suggested. "She's not angry about a pregnancy," Petra said, watching Callum's face as the information settled. "She's angry that the genetic integrity of the ascendancy has been compromised in a facility she personally authorized. You're not a father in her framework. You're a quarantine risk. Your genetic material is evidence. And Nalith is not an expectant mother. She's a genetic offender." "And the child?" Petra's expression shifted into something that was not quite pity and not quite warning, but occupied the precise midpoint between them. "The child is classified as invasive biology." Under Vethari genetic law, the Oversight Bureau has authority for forced termination of unauthorized conceptions. Hybrid conceptions are not accepted. They are prioritized. The secure wing of the research station had been repurposed into what Petra described as a diplomatic containment environment, and what Callum, with the blunt accuracy of a man whose patience for euphemism had been exhausted, described as a prison with better lighting. He and Nalith were housed in adjacent quarters, monitored, restricted, separated by a wall that contained, he suspected, more surveillance equipment than structural material. He had not been allowed to see her since the lockdown. His requests were processed through Vethari security channels that acknowledged receipt and provided no response, a bureaucratic technique that he recognized from every administrative system he had ever encountered. The deliberate absence of refusal, which was harder to challenge than refusal itself because there was nothing to push against. On the third day, Petra secured a supervised meeting. The room was small, neutral, monitored by systems whose presence was not concealed, because concealment would have implied the Vethari cared whether their surveillance was noticed, and they did not. Nalith sat across from him, and the change in her was visible in ways that went beyond the obvious fatigue of someone who had spent 3 days in custody. Her bioluminescent patterns had dimmed, the usual amber muted to something closer to ochre, the slow pulse of someone whose system was operating under sustained stress. But beneath the dimness, scattered through the familiar patterns like words in an unfamiliar language, new colors moved, flickers of warm gold and soft copper that appeared and vanished in rhythms that did not match her own heartbeat. "The medical team has been here twice," she said. Her voice was controlled, but the harmonic undertone, the secondary Vethari vocal frequency that carried emotional truth, trembled at its edges. "They have not performed the termination. The empress has not yet issued the final order, but the preparation protocol been described by her own staff as Petra consulted her notes, beyond the spectrum of advisable engagement. "I study plants," Callum said. "I have spent 14 months studying how living things on this planet adapt. I have something to say about adaptation that she needs to hear. And if I say it to anyone other than her, it will be filtered and translated and processed until whatever truth it contains has been bureaucratically extracted, and what remains is inoffensive and useless." He looked at Petra with the calm, focused expression of a man who had spent his career in environments where patience was not passivity but strategy. "I need to talk to her directly. Please make it possible." Petra looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her communication device and began making calls. The Empress's private council chamber had been established in the station's administrative wing, and it carried the particular atmosphere of a space that had been claimed by a presence too large for its dimensions. The furniture was standard station issue, but the room felt smaller than it was, contracted by the gravity of the woman who occupied it. Valith Sorkine sat behind a desk that she had not chosen, and that was clearly beneath the dignity of a sovereign, who governed from a throne carved from compressed planetary core material. And the indignity of the furniture did nothing to diminish the fact that she dominated the room the way a storm dominates a landscape. Not through violence, but through the atmospheric certainty that everything within range was subject to conditions she controlled. Her bioluminescent patterns had shifted from the jagged crimson of her arrival to something slower and more dangerous. A deep, pulsing garnet that her guards recognized as sustained imperial displeasure, which was worse than rage because rage burned out and displeasure was maintained through will, and the Empress's will was the most thoroughly maintained instrument in the ascendancy. Callum entered. He was accompanied by Petra, whose role was officially diplomatic liaison and was practically the person whose career would end if this went wrong. 2 Vethari guards flanked the door. The room was small enough that Callum could have crossed it in 4 steps, but the distance between the door and the Empress's desk felt considerably larger, because Valeth's molten gold eyes found him the moment he entered, and the weight of her attention was a physical thing that pressed against his chest and suggested, without words, that the space between them existed at her discretion. "The human xenobotanist," she said. Her voice carried the deep harmonic resonance of Vethari speech amplified by centuries of genetic refinement. A voice engineered to be heard, to command, to make the listener's body respond to its frequency before the mind processed its content. "You requested this audience." "I did. You understand that you are here under genetic quarantine protocol, that you are classified as a contamination vector, and that any statement you make may be entered into the legal proceedings against your co-offender." "I understand." "Then speak, and understand that I am listening not because your words have earned my attention, but because the diplomatic liaison has made a compelling argument regarding the consequences of not listening, and I am not yet willing to test that argument's limits." Callum looked at the Empress of the Vethari ascendancy, her garnet bioluminescence, her gold eyes, her absolute authority over every life on this planet including his, and he spoke to her the way he had spent 14 months speaking to the living systems of her world, which was honestly, precisely, and without deference to what they were supposed to be doing versus what they were actually doing. "I'm a xenobotanist," he said. "I've spent 14 months studying your planet's highland flora, specifically adaptive pollination mechanisms, the ways your native plant species have evolved to exchange genetic material across environmental barriers that should prevent it. And what I've found, consistently, in every ecosystem I've studied, is that the most resilient species on your world are the ones that incorporated genetic variation, not the ones that restricted it." The Empress's garnet bioluminescence did not change. Her expression did not change. But her golden eyes narrowed by a fraction that Callum registered, because he had spent months learning to read Vethari physiological signals, and because the fraction was the Vethari equivalent of someone leaning forward. "Your highland apex species, the Valrenthi, has survived 3 extinction-level climate shifts. It survived because a mutation introduced through cross-pollination with a lowland variant gave it thermal tolerance that the original genome lacked. Your marine kelp forests, the ones your ascendancy considers the most biologically perfect ecosystem on the planet, exist because of a hybridization event 11,000 years ago that your own botanical records classify as anomalous. Anomalous, not catastrophic, because the anomaly made the system stronger." He paused, not for dramatic effect, but because the next part required more care than the rest. "Your doctrine of genetic purity has maintained stability for 2,000 years. I don't question that. Stability is valuable, but stability is not the same as strength. Every closed genetic system in biological history, every single one, on every world I have ever studied, eventually encounters a challenge it cannot adapt to, because adaptation requires variation, and variation requires the introduction of something the system did not plan for." He met her gold eyes. "Your doctrine isn't protecting your species, it's making your species brittle, and brittleness doesn't fail slowly, it fails all at once." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that fills a room when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and that the most powerful person present is deciding how to respond to. Valeth's bioluminescent patterns shifted, the garnet dimming at the edges, replaced by something slower and more complex, colors moving through the tracery along her temples in patterns that her guards had never seen, and that the Vethari physiological lexicon would classify, if it had a classification, as the signature of a sovereign encountering an argument that her certainty could not immediately dismiss. "You compare my species to plants," she said. "I compare your genetic doctrine to every closed biological system I've ever studied. The comparison is accurate. And the child, the hybrid that your genetic material, has produced in violation of every protocol my ascendancy maintains. Is data, Callum said, and he knew the word was cold and he chose it deliberately because the Empress did not respond to warmth. She responded to precision. One data point. The first evidence your civilization would have of what hybrid genetics actually produce versus what your doctrine assumes they produce. You can destroy it, which is what doctrine requires. Or you can study it, which is what science requires. And I have spent enough time on your world to know that the Vethari consider themselves a scientific civilization before they consider themselves anything else. Valith was silent for a long time. Her golden eyes held his with an intensity that most beings would have found unbearable, and that Callum withstood, because he had spent his career being stared at by things more alien than an empress, fungi, root systems, pollination mechanisms that defied every model he brought to them. And he had learned that the only appropriate response to being scrutinized by something you did not fully understand was to hold still and let the scrutiny complete itself. There is a provision, she said finally, and her voice had changed, not softened. The Empress did not soften but shifted into a register that was less decree and more deliberation. The doctrine of observed exception. It has not been invoked in 600 years. It permits a single deviation from genetic protocol to exist under permanent imperial monitoring, as a living study of the deviation's effects. Callum waited because the statement was not yet complete and he could feel the weight of what was coming. I am not persuaded, Valith said. I want that understood. Your argument does not dismantle 2,000 years of doctrine. But a sovereign who destroys evidence rather than studying it is not a leader. She is a coward operating under the guise of tradition. Her bioluminescence settled into a deep, steady amber, the color of formal imperial decision. The exception is granted. The child will be born. The child will be monitored. And you, human, her gold eyes burned into his. You will stay. Because if this experiment produces what you claim it might, I will need the scientist who proposed it present to explain the results. And if it produces what I expect, instability, incompatibility, failure, I will need you present to witness that your argument was wrong. And if it's something neither of us expects. The faintest shift crossed the Empress's expression, not a smile, not warmth, but the barest acknowledgement that the question was the right one. Then we will both learn something, she said, which is, I am told, what scientists do. Callum did not leave Vethari Prime. He submitted a formal extension of his research contract, which the Academic Oversight Board processed with the bewildered efficiency of an institution that had no precedent for a xenobotanist voluntarily remaining on an alien world under imperial genetic monitoring, but that was not prepared to argue with a sovereign decree. He moved from the departing researchers' quarters to a permanent residential unit in the station's long-term wing, and the departure checklist on his laboratory wall, with its 43 items and its 37 completed checkmarks, remained pinned where it was because taking it down felt like closing a door he was not ready to close, and leaving it up felt like an honest reminder that the life he had planned and the life he was living had diverged at a doorway, where a woman with shifting bioluminescent patterns told him something that changed everything. Nalith found him in the greenhouse on the evening of the 7th day. The highland flora specimens he had spent 14 months cataloging surrounded them in careful rows, alien plants that had adapted across millennia to conditions that should have killed them, surviving through variation and stubbornness, and the blind, persistent drive of living things to continue living regardless of what the environment or the doctrine or the Empress said about whether they should. She stood beside him at the observation window, where the last light of Vethari Prime's sun caught the edges of the highland specimens and set them glowing, and she placed his hand against the skin of her forearm, where the bioluminescent patterns traced their familiar paths. But the patterns were not entirely familiar anymore. New colors moved through them, warm gold, soft copper, hues that did not exist in the standard Vethari physiological spectrum, flickering in rhythms that did not match her heartbeat because they were synchronized to a different heartbeat. Smaller and faster, the pulse of something growing inside her that was neither fully Vethari nor fully human, but something new, something that no genetic doctrine had predicted and no database could classify. The medical team cannot identify these patterns, she said. Her voice was quiet, but the harmonic undertone carried a frequency Callum had learned to recognize during their months in the Highlands, the frequency of wonder, the sound a Vethari voice made when it encountered something that exceeded its models. They are not in any Vethari record. The pigmentation pathways are expressing sequences that our genome has never produced. Callum looked at the new colors moving beneath her skin, the living evidence of something his entire career had been spent studying in other species, and that he was now witnessing in the most personal form imaginable. Adaptation, not the slow, generational kind that textbooks described, but the immediate, urgent kind, a biological system encountering something unprecedented and responding not with failure or rejection, but with creation, generating new patterns, new expressions, new possibilities from the collision of two genetic architectures that had never met before and that were, against every prediction and every doctrine, making something beautiful. It's not contamination, he said. No. Nalith's amber-copper eyes met his, and the new gold patterns along her cheekbones pulsed once slowly, in time with the heartbeat that was not hers. It is not. Outside the greenhouse, Vethari Prime's sun sank below the mountain line, and the highland specimens responded to the diminishing light by producing their own soft bioluminescent glows in a dozen shades, the adaptive response of plants that had learned, across millennia of evolution, to make their own light when the world's light failed. And inside the greenhouse, in the warm gold glow of patterns that no doctrine had planned for and no database could name, a man who studied how living things survived, and a woman whose body was inventing new ways to prove that survival was possible sat together among the evidence that the universe's oldest argument between control and change, between purity and adaptation, between the way things have always been and the way things might become, had been settled, as it always was, not by doctrine or decree, but by the quiet, stubborn insistence of life itself, doing what life has always done.